to a special edition of the Darden Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. In this episode of the podcast, we return to our ongoing Women at Darden Spotlight series with a conversation featuring Senior Assistant Dean for Admissions Donna Clark and Carolyn Miles. Carolyn is an alumna of the Darden School, graduating in the class of 1988, and she recently completed a term as the interim president of the Darden School Foundation. She continues to serve at the Darden School as a professor of practice and as a senior advisor to the dean, helping the school implement its ambitious 2030 sustainability goals. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. As always, if this conversation is helpful for you, please like this episode and subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an update. And remember, you can always check the episode description for links to Darden blogs, social channels, and more. And now, without further ado, here's our recent Women at Darden conversation featuring Donna Clark and Carolyn Miles.
Hello, everybody. My name is Donna Clark. I'm the Senior Assistant Dean of Admissions for Darden. Thrilled to be here today with Carolyn Miles and excited to introduce you to Carolyn, who is a Darden alumna and former professor of practice. Carolyn served as CEO of Save the Children, an organization that gives children in the United States and around the world a healthy start, educational opportunities, and protection from harm. Save the Children serves over 150 million children in the U.S. and in 120 countries. As a global organization, Save the Children has committed to driving down the numbers of preventable deaths of children under 5, ensuring every student gets a high-quality basic education, and protecting children from harm. Prior to Save the Children, Carolyn worked in the private sector in Hong Kong for American Express and as an entrepreneur. While in Asia, she confronted the deprivation of the region's children, which motivated her to dedicate her life to their welfare. In 2015, Carolyn was named one of the 50 world's greatest leaders by Fortune magazine and inducted into the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame. I had the pleasure of working with her most recently in her role as interim president of the Darden School Foundation, and she happens to be a friend of mine. Please join me, everyone, in welcoming Carolyn. Carolyn, hello.
Hello, Donna, and thank you. Great to be here. Always good to be here with prospective students to Darden.
Well, we're so glad. We're so grateful for your time. You have such an interesting background, and I happen to know a little bit about it before Darden. Could you tell everybody a little bit about your background prior to choosing to get your MBA, and then we'll get into what prompted you to select Darden?
Sure. So I think I have an interesting background prior to Darden in that I was not really focused on business. I grew up in Pittsburgh and I went to Bucknell University, which is in the middle of Pennsylvania in a little town called Lewisburg. And I was an animal behavior major. So that was where I was. So a lot of biology, kind of like a pre-vet, pre-med. Mm-hmm. And I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian. And I worked one summer for a veterinarian and I found out that I fainted every time the veterinarian would do a surgery. And this happened like 3 times. So he finally
that kind of rules that out.
Yeah, he said, I think you better go work at the desk for the summer. So I did. But I really loved animal behavior because it was this mix between, there's a lot of science and it was also a lot of psychology, which I really enjoyed. So I ended up finishing at Bucknell, and then I went to the Midwest and I worked for a company called FMC as a sales rep. I was the first female sales rep they ever had in the Midwest, so that was super interesting. And I remember speaking to my boss at the time, and I was like, I really love marketing. That's kind of what I really like. And I like to think about why people do the things they do. And he said, well, you could work your way up in sales and it would probably take you 6 or 7 years, or you could go back to business school. And I was like, oh, interesting. So I started checking out business schools, and that's led me to Darden after really a lot of soul searching and thinking about where did I want to go and what did I want to do. I felt like Darden was a great, great fit for me. So, but I started out with really no academic background in business, and then just 3 years of experience in sales, which I thought was a great experience to bring to Darden.
And I'm so glad you shared that, because so many people who come to Darden don't have a traditional business background or may not have graduated from college thinking of an MBA. So here's a great example. What were some of the factors that led you to choose Darden specifically? What were you looking for, and what was it about Darden that attracted you to accept the offer of admission here?
Yeah, I think it was a couple things. I mean, I had actually looked at UVA as an undergrad, and I remembered how much I loved Charlottesville. So I was already kind of predisposed, I guess, to think about the area and the part of the country. But it was really the case method, I have to say, that sold me on Darden. I am someone who really learns the best by kind of experiencing something.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is very much what the case method is about. It's about experiencing business problems and business challenges. And that for me is a great, great way to learn. I also felt like it was a good fit because Darden is about general management. And so it's not about, because my background was not, I wasn't heavy into finance or marketing or any of those things. Again, my business experience was just the time I had outside of, college working. So I really felt like a general management focus was very good for me. Darden really forces you to take classes in all different disciplines. And I actually liked that because I thought that was a good thing for me to get that breadth of experience in business and to understand. I thought I liked marketing, but I really wanted to experience operations and finance and organizational behavior and all the kinds of things that Darden gives you the opportunity to do. So
And that makes so much sense with you having gone to such a good liberal arts school and had that holistic perspective of business and all the functional areas and the exposure to all the industries.
Yeah.
What were some of the highlights of your Darden experience? I know we could probably talk about this for a long time, but if you had to pick a couple of examples, highlights of the Darden experience.
So as it turned out, I ended up rooming at Darden with a college hallmate from my freshman year, Helen Brownell. And so Helen and we both kind of came to this conclusion that we're going to Darden separately. I mean, we'd been in touch, but we really weren't, doing it together or anything like that. But we both came to that conclusion. We were like, wow, we got our room together. So we lived in Ivy Gardens, beautiful Ivy Gardens. And that part of the experience was great.
Nice.
Helen was an accounting major. She helped me out like so much in accounting, which I really didn't like. But anyway, we got through it. So I think having somebody you knew was great, but it was also so much about meeting the people at Darden and the community at Darden. I know we'll talk about the community a little bit later, but as somebody I was very nervous about coming to Darden because I felt like, I am not as well versed academically in the disciplines at Darden than a lot of people might be coming, or so I thought. And so I was pretty nervous, and
very common for people to come in having that same feeling.
Yep. But I think the community at Darden and the fact that you have people who are coming from all different experiences. Most everybody has worked for at least a couple of years when they get to Darden, at least when similarly to now and back then the same. So they were coming with lots of different experiences. And I think one of the best things about the experience is that you can always bring something to the table, right? So I always felt like I could add some value to the conversations. And that you had the ability to do that. So that was fantastic. I think the sections and the way that sections work at Darden, you get to know a group of 60 or so people, 65 people really well because you are in those classes all the time with the same people for your first year. And that really it engenders these friendships that really last forever. And I still have very, very, very good friends that I made during the time that I was at Darden. So it was all those experiences, and it was the in-classroom experience where you felt like you could add value. And that was really important to me. So I think those were some of the things. I loved Charlottesville. I still love Charlottesville as a place to go to school. It's a fantastic experience and lots of fun things to do. So,
and I know I think if you are such that ultimate connector, you had a reunion last year and maintain a lot of your long-term relationships from Darden.
Many. And I think that's actually one of the things that I think makes Darden quite different from other schools is the alumni network. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go. But the alumni network is super strong. And really, like every step of the way on my career, there's always been a Darden person that's helped me. And they were, alums. They didn't know who I was. They just knew I went to Darden. So there was this commonality of experience. And I think that is really different from, Darden's the only business school I went to. So, but from what I understand from other people, that is very unique.
Yeah.
And so it's not hard to do, I guess, is what I would say.
You mentioned, well, I'll just jump ahead because you mentioned the Darden community, and Darden is so well known for its community. Can you talk a little bit about your experience first as a student
Yes.
and how you experience the Darden community?
Yeah. So I talked about the sections, and the other thing that I think really brings people together. And so that brings you together with a group of people that you really get to know well. And then the other thing is there's a lot of both social activities as well as academic activities where you have a team of people. So it could be your learning team, which we called study groups back then. But that's a much smaller group. That's usually 5 or 6. It could be the competitions that you do as part of Darden Cup. We had this crazy basketball team that we did basketball with. We were all horrible basketball players, but we had such a good time.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of ability to form smaller groups and do really either fun things or hard academic things together. And so that helps you kind of build community at an even tighter, in an even tighter group. So one story I'll tell that kind of maybe is a good example of how this works. So I actually met my husband at Darden. And I met him the first day of Darden.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
At the beer truck. Oh. Anyway, so that's where we met. But we actually never really went out as a couple until the second year because there were so many things that we were doing together with groups, big groups, small groups. We were always with a group from Darden. Yeah. So a lot of people didn't even know we were together until second year, and we got engaged in our second year. We got married that summer. But some people were like, well, we just would see you were just out with everybody else. And that's kind of how it was. It was, and still is, I would say, very much around a community of people that enjoyed each other's company and had a good time, worked super hard. You're always paired up with different people to learn different things. And, it's like the thing that I think that is so important, because when you find yourself in business, and many of you who are on this call, I'm sure, have this experience already, you are thrown into groups all over the place when you're in the workforce, right? And sometimes those groups are great, and sometimes they are a challenge, but you learn how to get everybody in the group kind of to go in the same direction, right? They can be hard, they can be fun, they can be easy, they could be, tough, but working in groups is what you're going to be doing in your work life. And I think so much of Darden is about that. And so that experience, I think, is really fantastic. And by the end of your second year, because of all this work that you're doing in all different groups of people, you pretty much end up knowing your entire class, right? Because you've been in different classes, different groups, different social activities. You've been in all these different groups of people. And it's really, so when you when you go back for reunion, for example, it's amazing. I thought, oh, I'm not going to know it. Like, oh, am I going to remember everybody? And then you get there and you're like, oh, of course, these
Yeah, how
people that were
nice.
in this group or that group or the other group. So, and I do think that's quite different
Yeah.
than other
Yeah,
business.
the strength of those relationships and how
Yeah.
well they're cultivated here. You mentioned the case method and how it was such a good fit for
Mhm.
you by learning by experience. Because it's a Women at Darden webinar, can you talk a
Yeah.
little bit about how you think the case method benefits women in particular?
Yeah, I think it benefits women, and I think women have to be ready for the case method. So one of the things I would say is that I mentioned this before, that everybody has value to add
Mm-hmm.
in the case method. So, you know, I remember taking a class in finance. And again, my background was not in finance. And that was something that I really had to work hard at understanding finance. And it was super useful for me later in my career. But I could also bring into that finance case the other experiences that I had, because what case method makes you realize is that business is about human interaction, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
about people and it's about people interacting and making things happen, right? It's not just about kind of the numbers on a page, right? And the cases are about the numbers on a page, but the people that have to either convince somebody about what the numbers on the page
Mm-hmm.
mean, or what actions you should take because of the numbers on the page. And that's about people. And
Mm-hmm.
so oftentimes you can bring other experiences into something. If somebody's uneasy about taking forward this business case, for example, right? You have those experiences in your own business experience to say, well, this person, they're probably feeling like this, and maybe what they need to do is go talk to this other person who can help them be more confident in those numbers, right? So I think that the case method is really good at being able to bring everybody's experience to bear.
Mm-hmm.
And that is different than a professor standing up and giving a lecture on accounting principles, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is very different. And for me, that was a much better way to learn, and enabled me to participate in those discussions in a way that I think in maybe a more traditional classroom I would
Yeah.
not have been able to do.
Well, one of the things that I hear a lot of people say too is it's just so engaging that's a
Yes.
pleasant surprise for people, how engaging the
Yep.
conversation is.
Yeah, very much so. And I think, maybe shifting a little bit to the professor side, one of the things that I did not probably appreciate as much before I became a professor at Darden, was how difficult it is to orchestrate the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems like when you're on the student side, it seems like students are just kind of all over the place and they're throwing in ideas, and people are, saying things that are the opposite of what the other person said. And the professors at Darden are extremely skilled at bringing those principles and the things that they want you to learn from the discussion kind of back around, so that you
Mm-hmm.
really are learning the principles and the theories of what the professor is trying to teach you. And it is a lot harder than I think it looked from the student side. I
was going to
much
ask
better
you about that
appreciation.
later, but I'm going to just do it now since it's coming
Yeah.
up kind of organically. Yeah, what was the transition like? You experienced Darden as a student, but then
Yeah.
what was that translation? What was that experience like when you came back as a professor of practice?
Yeah, I think, as I said, I got a much deeper appreciation for how difficult that is to do, and how you really have to think through kind of where do I want us to end this
Mm-hmm.
class? And then how do I work backwards to make sure that I'm asking the right questions? So when you prepare a case for Darden, you'll have a case to read, and it will have, could it be anywhere from 3 or 4 pages to 25 or 30 pages. And it has a lot of data, it has a lot of information. And then you need to ask students to think about 3 or 4 questions that you want them to come prepared to talk about in the class. And you kind of have to get the right questions there so that you end up somewhere around the right place in terms of what people learn. But one of the hardest things is letting the class go in a way, letting people bring those topics up and coming around to some of the answers on the case themselves without jumping in, without giving the answer. And students are also very good at trying to get professors to give them the answer. You really have to resist doing that because that's not the way the case method really works. And so it is just much harder to do on the other side. And I think as a student, I thought, oh, this is easy to teach a class at Darden. You just kind of stand up there and you ask some questions and you let students, talk about it. But it is much harder, I think, to get the principles out of that class than it looks.
And then that makes it all the more, impressive for those of you who may not know, Darden has such a longstanding reputation for offering the best educational program, MBA program, and the best teaching faculty. So interesting to hear just how difficult that is and to excel to that extent in the classroom as well.
Yes. And I was a professor of practice, so I was new to the whole thing. The vast majority, and I got it after a while, but it is challenging. The majority of the Darden faculty are extremely skilled in doing this and in teaching in the case method. It's pretty amazing to watch.
Switching gears a little bit, can you tell everybody a little bit about your career after Darden, but before Save the Children? You did some really interesting things in between Darden and Save the Children.
So at Darden, you don't, as I said, it's a general management education. So you don't major in anything at Darden, but you can have a concentration. And my concentration was marketing. And that's again, I talked even from the time when I was in undergrad, this idea of like, how do you get people to buy things that you want them to buy or think things that you want, how do you drive that kind of behavior that you're looking for from a marketing standpoint. So I had a marketing concentration and focus, and I went to work for American Express in New York. And my, at the time, fiance got a job also in New York. So we went to New York together. And I worked for Amex for a couple of years in marketing. I was marketing the green credit card, the kind of classic credit card, which was super fun. And I had an opportunity with Amex to go internationally with Amex. And this was a program, they don't do it this way anymore, but it was a fantastic program. They basically picked 5 people who were in New York, and they picked 5 people internationally. And you didn't switch countries, but those 5 came into New York, and the 5 in New York went somewhere. But they didn't really tell you where they were going to go. You were going to go. So they said, do you want to do this program? And I said, well, where would we go? And they said, well, we can't tell you. And I was like, okay. Wow. So here's a lesson I would pass on. So I went to my, by then he was my husband, Brendan. And I said, do you want to go work internationally? And he said, well, where would we go? And I said, well, I don't know. And he said, okay. So lesson number 1, when you decide you're going to have a partner or a spouse, you need to make the choice of the person who's ready to support you no matter what. And he was
such an important decision,
such an important thing. So, and it turned out to be a fantastic experience. So I did find out a week before we were going that I was pregnant with our first child. So that was great, but not really planned so much, but it turned out to be fine. So we went to Hong Kong in the end, and it was a great experience. So I worked for American Express there for about 3 years, and my husband was working for Citibank, and we had a fantastic time in Hong Kong. And then I decided I had my second son. So I had my 2 sons in Hong Kong. And when I had the second one, I had this job that was traveling all over the region. So I was working on the card acceptance side. So I was calling on hotels and airlines and setting up frequent flyer programs and all sorts of very cool stuff. But I decided it was really a lot of travel with two little kids. And so I decided to join my Darden classmate, Tom Neer, who had started a coffee business in Hong Kong. And so he said, hey, why don't you come? He had one shop. Why don't you come? Because I really want to kind of really make this a chain of coffee shops in Hong Kong, and you can be the marketing person. And I was like, okay.
Yeah.
So I left American Express. I joined Tom, and we, over a year and a half, we opened 27
Wow.
Pacific Coffee Company locations. And it was
Wow.
crazy, crazy, crazy. And I wasn't really just the marketing person. It was whatever, because it was the two of us. And we had a fantastic experience. And Pacific Coffee Company, if you look it up, it's now, we do not own it anymore. We sold it, but it is now 450 locations, I think, across China, Hong Kong, Singapore. Anyway, it was a great, great experience.
Wow, that's awesome.
So much. And the other thing that happened during my time in Hong Kong was we traveled a lot with these two little boys, and we traveled all over the region. And that was when I think for me, this realization that kids had such different opportunities around the world than our children have. So, you know, my children were born to my husband and I, very well educated, by global standards, extremely wealthy. We weren't, of course, but by global standards, we were.
Right.
And my kids would go on to do anything they wanted, right?
Yeah.
And the kids that we met in the countries that we traveled to had so few experiences. Opportunities. A lot of them were being born into poverty. They would not be able to leave those places. And I saw that in many, many of the countries that we traveled to. And
I've heard you tell this very poignant story about, I believe it was in the Philippines,
yes.
And kind of a moment when a light bulb went off for you. Can you share that story?
Sure. So that was, and I actually just recently went back to the Philippines this past fall, which was a great trip. But we were traveling as a family to the Philippines. We were on vacation, and we drove. If anybody on the phone has ever done this, you drive from the airport to Manila, and you drive through a lot of very, very poor communities on the way. And
I know exactly what you're talking about. I've been there.
So on either side of the highway is very, very poor communities. And we had stopped at a stoplight, and I had my son, at that point, Patrick, my second son, was probably about 6 months old, and I was holding him. And we stopped at a stoplight, and there was a woman with a baby who was basically the same age, I'm sure, as Patrick. And she was begging at the window. And on both sides were these very poor communities, just basically shacks, and lots of kids and people begging. And I looked at her, and she looked at me, and my thought was, this child that I held in my arms was going to have every opportunity.
Right.
And the child that she held in her arms would have very few opportunities, most likely, and would grow up in this very poor community, and probably live there and have their own children there. And that's where they would be. And so that was a moment when I really thought about, there must be different things that are being done for children to give them different opportunities. And so I started doing nonprofit work in Hong Kong, and as a volunteer.
Yeah.
And when we came back to the US, I said, this is really what I want to do, at least now, while my kids are young, and I want to, find the opportunity to do that. And so, again, a Darden person introduced me to people at UNICEF and Save the Children and other big nonprofits that were focused on children. And then I think it was fate. There was a job that was very much aligned with the skills that I had. And I was able to join Save the Children. And honestly, I thought I would be there for maybe 5 years or so when my kids were getting to school age. And we had then adopted a little girl from Vietnam at the same, within a couple of years. But I thought I'll go back to business, but I didn't. I ended up there for 22 years.
Can you tell everybody about your trajectory at Save the Children? I know you played a few different roles before you became the CEO.
Sure. So my first role was actually very much in line with some of the work that I had done at American Express and Pacific Coffee Company. It was about bringing new donors into Save the Children, and it was using television advertising, using the beginnings of the internet. So they had a page that just sat there with their telephone number, and that was their idea of the internet. So I was like, I think we might be able to do some other things there. So I think one of the things that was really important to me, and I would say a lesson that I learned along my path, was that when you come into an opportunity, adding value was really important to me. And I felt like, wow, I have learned a lot of things, both at Darden and in my experiences the last couple of years, that I could bring to Save the Children, and I could add value. The second thing was, I think you need to be passionate about what you're doing. And I was really passionate because of my experience, I think, in Asia. I was really passionate about doing something that would help children. And then the third thing was, could I learn something? And I was going to learn a lot because I knew nothing about nonprofits. I really did not, except for my volunteer experience. But I really didn't understand kind of how they worked and how that might work. And so that first job at Save the Children was, I think, really important because I felt like even if I didn't understand quite how a big nonprofit worked, and I wasn't quite sure how you could get things done, because it was very different than the corporate or the, startup, which is the two kind of businesses I'd been in. At least I could add value because I knew a lot of things that I could bring to Save the Children. So that was my first job. And I did that for about 5-6 years. And I got more responsibility as things went on. And then I became the COO, and I worked for this current CEO, and I was able to get a very, very broad understanding of the organization. And Save the Children is a big global organization. As nonprofits go, it's very large. And so as COO, I really got to see a lot of the organization. And then after 7 years as the COO, I became the CEO. And I was there for 9 years as the CEO. So I really had very senior management experience for about 15 years while I was there, 16 years while I was there.
And you mentioned how big Save the Children is, but under your leadership, I recall the resources that you were able to ascertain through fundraising was astronomical. Can you talk a little bit about that achievement?
Yeah, so it was a really interesting time to be at Save the Children. And again, I think my Darden experience was so useful because there was a huge amount of growth happening in NGOs generally, but really within organizations like Save the Children. And Save the Children really grew. It was about $140 million organization when I came. And when I left, it was about a $900 million organization.
Wow.
So, and now it's over $1 billion organization. So there was a lot of growth. And one of the things that Save the Children did, and I'm so glad we did this now, looking at what's happening in the world, but we really diversified our funding base. So when I came, we had two sources of funding. One was the US government. We all know what's happening with the US government funding to NGOs right now. It's really, really tough. And the other was entry-level donors, the thing I was working on when I came to Save the Children. And we decided to diversify funding in a very big way. So we started looking at companies, foundations, high wealth individuals, which prior to that really gave to universities, and they gave to kind of health issues, but they weren't giving to organizations like SAVE. So we had a big push there. And so that was a really important part of what I was part of. The other thing, in order to make that happen, we did a lot of work on impact. And so when I first came to Save the Children, I'd have to say that if you asked people to show the impact of what Save the Children was doing, it was very difficult for people to do that on a global basis. They could show you a project, and they could say, well, here is a maternal health project in Ethiopia, and here's what we're able to do. One project.
Right.
But if you said, well, what the portfolio of all the programs that you do on maternal and child health around the world, what does that all add up to? Very difficult for people to do.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I worked really hard on, primarily as this, initially as the COO and then as the CEO, was we had to get much sharper with impact. Because if you want someone to give you $20 million to an organization, it's not going to be just trust us, we're doing good work and it's good for children. That's not what people are going to give you $20 million to do.
Right.
They're going to give you $20 million to change a set of countries' trajectory in terms of the number of kids that die under the age of 5. And if you can't show them that, and you can't demonstrate that over time, they're going to say, actually, we're going to go somewhere where we can understand the impact. So that was super important. And that was something that really drove a lot of that growth, was being able to demonstrate impact in education programs, in health programs for children, in programs around disaster response. And how do you actually do that? And that was a big change and a big shift. So.
Yeah, the breadth and the scope is just, having spoken to you about it over the years, being involved in like you said, disaster relief, like after a tsunami and things, like the scope was incredibly broad.
Yeah. And I think to be able to also say, Save the Children focuses on 3 things. They focus on saving the lives of kids under the age of 5 from preventable deaths. So that's the health piece. Education, making sure that every child that we work with in an education program gets through at least primary school, which in many countries, to get to the 6th grade, that's education. And that's what the education system is all about. So make sure every child can do that. And then go on if they're able to, but at least get a 6th grade education, and then protecting kids from harm in emergencies, particularly. And so getting sharper on what does Save the Children do versus other organizations, and how do we drive impact in those areas that we're really focused on, that I think has made a huge difference in terms of the success of Save the Children. And then attracting donors, because that's what donors want to know. They want to know, how is my investment going to change things, and how is that going to happen? And having that kind of thinking, and having the business background that I had, I think was super, super useful at an organization like Save the Children.
When you think about your success at Save the Children, how did Darden prepare you for that? What do you attribute to the Darden experience that you utilized when you were in that role?
Well, I think so. When I think back on the things that I was able to bring to the party, so I talked about being at Darden and having to take finance classes, right? Being able to read a balance sheet, super important. And being able to understand the finances of the organization and what was driving those finances, and how, where we really were in terms of our financial health and our financial strength. Of course, we had a CFO, we had people in our finance team, but the CEO being able to actually understand those numbers and being able to engage in those conversations, really, really helpful. I think my marketing background, that's how I got into Save the Children, because I was a marketer and I understood how to develop materials that would incent people to support the organization. So that was really important. The operations background that I got at Darden. So Save the Children is a really diverse organization we have. There are programs in between 110 and 120 countries around the world. There are, 57 languages spoken among the staff. There's so many, you can't even count the number of ethnic minorities that are represented because it's all people who work in that country. So it's a very, very diverse group of people. And being able to lead an organization that has that kind of diversity, I think my Darden experience was really fantastic because it was this experience that gave you the exposure to all different people from all different places who had all different life experiences. And that was, I think, really, really important.
Yeah.
And, the nonprofit world is very consensus and collaborative based. So decisions get made. I mean, ultimately, people have to make decisions at the top of the organization oftentimes, but it's much more of a consensus type of environment. And so, again, Darden is that kind of collaborative, consensus-based.
Yeah, you mentioned that when you were talking about your experience at Darden.
Yep. So lots of threads I could pull.
Right. I think of you as an incredibly loyal Darden graduate in terms of your commitment to Darden over the years, time, talent, energy, resources. What prompted you to serve? You've been were a long-term member of the Board of Trustees.
Yep.
What prompted you to remain so attached and involved in Darden as a trustee?
Yeah. So I think a couple things. I spoke about it earlier about this connection to Darden colleagues, Darden alums, every step of the way. When I went to American Express, there was a Darden person. When I started the coffee company, it was with my classmate. When I went to Save the Children, it was a Darden person who introduced me, right? And so that network and that, that's just been, and coming back to Darden to teach and be on the board. So those connections, I think, have been and I feel like I need to give back to the work, to the school, because those connections have been so inspirational and so important.
Such palpable, great examples of the power of the Darden network and how it's played out in your life and your career.
Yes, absolutely. And I think for me, I was lucky to be asked to be on the board, and that. So there were years when we were raising our kids, when they were little, that I was pretty unconnected to Darden. Really, that kind of those years right after you're connected, and then you kind of, your life just gets so crazy. So I was a little bit unconnected to the school for a little while, and then when we moved back to the U.S., I got reconnected with some of my Darden classmates, and then I was able to join the board when I was at Save the Children. So I think that really gave me the opportunity to see the school again. Some of the professors that were there when I was there were still there when I joined the board. There's one that's still there from when I was there in 1988. So there's a lot of continuity at Darden. So I just got to know the organization, the school again when I came back on the board. And then, when I had the opportunity after I left Save the Children, when I had the opportunity to come back and teach, again, it gave me another opportunity to see the school from another side. So,
and everyone, Carolyn came back to Darden not only as a professor of practice, but that she also served as the interim president of the Darden School Foundation, and wondering if you can talk a little bit about that role and what the Darden School Foundation does for Darden.
Sure. So the foundation is super important for Darden. It does things like provide a lot of the scholarships for Darden students, particularly for women. So it also is able to do things like hold assets like the hotel. So during the time so I came into the role as the president as an interim, and I was super clear. I was not looking for another full-time kind of 60-hour a week job, but I would be happy to jump in and be able to take on the interim role. And it was a very interesting time because we were opening the new hotel, the Forum Hotel at Darden, which is beautiful. And I hope all of you on the phone get to experience and see the hotel. It's a beautiful part of Darden. And so I was able to do that. And I was also able to work with a lot of our alums. So the foundation works with our alums to raise money for the school and to really focus, as I said, on things like scholarships, which are so, so important for Darden. And so I really enjoyed that experience. I guess I was kind of a natural choice to come and run the foundation on an interim basis because I had so much experience in the nonprofit side, and I knew all the people at Darden, and so it was actually great. I did it for a year, and it was fantastic. And I did say, I will do this for a year, and I will also be leading the search for the person who will take my job. And so I was able to do that as well. And I think that was a really fantastic experience. So
and everyone, there is an arboretum behind the hotel, and in a couple of weeks there is a dedication. There is a bench dedication to Carolyn, in part for her incredible leadership as interim president of the Darden School Foundation. Last question.
And a tree to my late husband.
And a tree to your late husband. Yeah. And I'm looking forward to being there for those dedications. Yeah. You mentioned earlier that you really like Charlottesville. I'm glad you like Charlottesville because you come back from time to time and we get to see you.
I do.
For some of the participants many of them have not been to Charlottesville. Can you talk just a little bit about Charlottesville and what you love about Charlottesville, since you did mention that earlier?
Yes, it is just a fantastic little city or big town. I'm not sure which it is, but whichever, it doesn't matter. I think Charlottesville is such a great place because it has, I guess, something for everyone, I would say. There's a lot of cultural activities there because of the university. So there's a lot. The music is fantastic. I love live music. And so you can go and listen to live music pretty much any night, anytime. There's always live music, whether it's downtown or it's out at one of the wineries, or there's live music any night that you want to go listen to live music. And I love listening to live music. So that's one thing I love about Charlottesville. There's also a lot of outdoor activities. So there is a great trail that runs almost all around Charlottesville called the Ravanna, and you can walk. I've tried to walk every section of it. I think I've gotten to almost all of them now. So you can go out and walk for an hour and walk one section, and you can, go to another part of the city and walk another section, and just beautiful. It's through beautiful parts of Charlottesville. So there's that. I mentioned the wineries. The wineries are fantastic. And when I was there, I have to say the wine was not very good.
Right. And there weren't as many wineries then as there are now.
There were only a few,
and they were 50 now.
They were not that good. So, but now the wineries are really, really good. So, and they're just beautiful settings. They're just beautiful places. You don't even have to drink wine. You can just go and enjoy the scenery. So that is a great thing. And there's a lot of, other cultural activities in Charlottesville. There's a lot of lectures because you have the university. You've got a lot of things that you can take advantage of, and food. It's a foodie town for sure. And so fantastic restaurants. And again, new ones all the time. And there's probably a list of like 15. You cannot go wrong picking any of them. So
I totally agree. One of my favorite things about Charlottesville too. Well, thank you so much, Carolyn, for sharing your story with our prospective students and admits. It's great to see you, and really appreciate you sharing your insights and experience and how Darden has impacted you.
So, you're absolutely welcome. Thank you.
And that was a recent Women at Darden conversation featuring Donna Clark and Carolyn Miles. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at Darden, that's DARDEN, @virginia.edu. Until next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.